Got quite a lot of material to get through here. Hopefully we'll be able to do it. So I'd like to start now if we can. Yes, there's a bit of an echo in the room. That's the wireless mic that I'm wearing. Sorry about that. This play, or this lecture on this play, Shakespeare's Tempest, is titled The Upstart Crew. That's a pun. It's a pun in honor of Shakespeare, who loved puns. You may know that Shakespeare's nickname was the Upstart Crow. Not totally relevant to today's lecture, but I've decided to title this lecture The Upstart Crew because I want to suggest that this play, in spite of many appearances to the contrary, is ultimately a play about politics. And that politics, in fact, is the preoccupation of this play, whether or not Shakespeare intended that to be the case. Now, those students who were in my seminar know my take on this business of authorial intention, that I don't get too worried about what authors actually intend, including you when you write your essays and present them in tutorial. The question is, what does the essay say? What does the play say? What can be said about what the play can be said to say? And in my reading of Shakespeare's Tempest, in any case, I see this, Shakespeare's final play, as fundamentally preoccupied with politics. And that's not the typical reading, so that's just by way of an introduction to the play. We'll say a little bit about Shakespeare's life. We don't have to say a great deal. For one thing, biography is not our primary concern in Arts 1. And also, Shakespeare's life is shrouded at pivotal moments in mystery. His birth dates seem to be his birth and death dates are uncontested. Well, actually, there is a little bit of controversy about this. We'll leave that alone. These are his dates. We know that Shakespeare's first arrival on the London theatrical scene happened around 1592. We have a first reference to him in which he's described as an upstart crow, which is where that nickname came from. So we have Shakespeare arriving on the theatrical scene in 1592. So we know he's at least important enough now to inspire some jealous reactions. So we know he's there. We don't know why he's there. He seems to have gotten out of Dodge in a hurry. He seems to have gotten out of Stratford in a hurry. There's a suggestion that maybe he was involved in stealing or poaching and had to get out of town. So there's all kinds of colorful stories that surround his life. We know that he was the son of a glover. We know that he did not have a formal university education. Probably one of the most striking features of Shakespeare's life is that he did not have a formal university education. He had a good grammar school education. This leads to some speculation about whether or not Shakespeare is even the author of his plays. And you've probably heard various debates about that. One of the first people to claim that Shakespeare was not the person that wrote these plays was a woman named Looney. So perhaps that's all that needs to be said about that thesis. My take on the Shakespeare isn't Shakespeare line, my favorite take on this comes from a famous Canadian literary critic named Northrop Frye, who said, I believe that Shakespeare's plays, all of Shakespeare's plays, were written by somebody else and that his name was William Shakespeare. So I like that line. In 1594, Shakespeare, a businessman, not just an actor and a playwright, forms a group called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. And in 1603, they're renamed the King's Men, and you'll see why in due course. The composition of this Shakespeare's last solely authored play is traditionally dated to 1610, 1611. And the fact that it's Shakespeare's last solely authored play is an important one, and in fact informs a lot of the more dominant interpretations of the play that we'll deal with briefly, if only to reject them as the ultimate sort of reading of the play. So we know that he doesn't die in 1611, but he dies soon after. So he retires from the stage, so to speak, in 1611 and retreats to the country. And after a night of heavy drinking, goes out in style, basically just dies a few years later. The lecture is broken into 4 parts. The first is called Shakespeare in Historical and Political Context. So I'll deal, hopefully fairly briefly with that as we work our way up to what I think is the kind of penultimate emphasis of the lecture, and that's the political side of Shakespeare. We need to say something about the political context in which he wrote. As you know, Shakespeare's life straddled that of 2 monarchs, the first of whom ruled for 45 years and is still very highly regarded by historians in Britain as probably one of the best and politically most astute and savvy monarchs that England ever generated, and that's Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry VIII. Her reign, which lasted for a very long time, is sometimes described as the Gloriana. It was seen as a glorious reign, especially by people that were propagandists for the Tudor regimes. But Shakespeare seems most of his life, of course, straddles the life of this particular monarch. In the latter part of his career, he's writing under James I, what's known as the Jacobean plays. Shakespeare's views on Elizabeth tend to be that, as far as we can tell, he seemed to be a Tudor apologist. He seemed to accept Tudor rule relatively unquestioningly. And there doesn't seem to be much controversy, although Shakespeare does become, as you'll see later, he does become embroiled in a little bit of controversy involving censorship in one of his plays. It was alleged to be aimed at undermining her rule. But otherwise, things seem to have been okay, and that under Elizabeth, Shakespeare seems to have thrived. Maybe James I, I want to suggest in this lecture, is a monarch that Shakespeare did not have a very high opinion of, and I think we can read this play as a veiled attack on James I, among other possibilities. This is the first Tudor monarch, Henry VII, who, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, killed the last English king to die in combat defending his throne, and that was Richard III. And he laid the foundation. This is going to be a quick and hopefully not too dirty history of the centralization of power in Britain prior to Shakespeare. In the 100 years prior to Shakespeare's existence, we have, the War of the Roses. You've probably heard about the War of the Roses. At the end of the War of the Roses, at the famous Battle of Bosworth Field, we have Richard III dying. Much of what we know about Richard III is colored by Shakespeare's interpretation of Richard III. He's groping around on a battlefield looking for a horse, my kingdom for a horse. Or if you like Monty Python, who tell the story anagrammatically, a shro, mein dinkum for a shro. So anyway, that's the end of the Plantagenet line. That's the beginning of the Tudor line. And by and large, the Tudor monarchs are very, very politically skilled and good monarchs. Not good in the sense that we necessarily love them, but politically speaking, very good monarchs. And they managed to bring, at least temporarily, an end to the sort of civil strife that beset England for most of the 1400s. And these wars were generally perceived as weaknesses in the crown and the institutions of governance, and the Tudor monarchs, beginning with Henry VII, set about to change that. And they're generally successful at doing so. Just briefly, we'll talk about Richard III. This is an actual portrait of Richard III, in which he looks more or less like a normal person. There are virtually no historical references to his alleged hunchback, and to his withered arm, and to his limp. That's a Shakespearean addition as far as we can tell. Now, it could be that Richard III had a minor deformity. That's why we have tailors. Tailors exist because nobody has a perfect body. So if one shoulder's a little bit higher than the other, we could say, okay, that's just a slight, we can't even call it a deformity. You're not symmetrical. But in Richard's case, it could be that this slight imperfection is turned into a kind of hunchback. And, here's an example of where Shakespeare can be quite overtly political, because he turns Richard III, this is Laurence Olivier's Richard III, he turns him into a hunchback with a kind of dead arm, who kind of drags his leg around and kind of walks like this. I hope I didn't kill the mic. And he compares him to he sets the style of politics in the Machiavellian style. In fact, the word Machiavel is actually mentioned in the opening parts of the play. Richard III is portrayed as a murderer who murders his two nephews in the Tower because he sees them as threats to the throne. All of this could be seen as perhaps true, but also as Tudor propaganda, pro-Tudor propaganda by Shakespeare. And I also would suggest, just for your amusement and edification, that Richard III may, to some extent, inspire this character, Edmund Blackadder, one of my favorite English television shows from the 1990s. All sorts of influences there, but maybe also Richard III. Getting back to Henry VII, he perceived that the crown had three major weaknesses that had to be addressed. One, it didn't have enough money. And if you've got a center of government called the crown that has to compete now with other emerging centers of power like Parliament, not having enough money is a difficult thing because you constantly have to go to Parliament to get money bills passed. So the Tudor monarchs had substantial hereditary revenues. They were on the victorious side of the War of the Roses. It was the House of Lancaster. They had lots of money. That was a good thing. They didn't have to go cap in hand to other would-be centers of power and ask for money. They set about to address what was then the major organ of governance, the council, which had become corrupt and inefficient, and they basically overhauled it. This is not an unprecedented thing. One will occasionally see presidents and prime ministers come to power and say they have to overhaul the organs of government or institutions of government, so they streamline it, they make it more efficient. This becomes a legacy of the Tudor monarchs that gets passed on to other, or Henry VII that gets passed on to other Tudor monarchs. And they had to address what they saw as the egotism of a lawless nobility. That's another way of saying there were lots of people running around with lots of money who saw themselves and fancied themselves as power centers in their own right. And this, of course, is what led to the civil strife during the 1400s. This is what led to the War of the Roses in the first place, various pretenders or claimants to the throne who wanted to have power. And so one way to address that would be to take on this essentially lawless nobility and bring them under the control of an increasingly powerful central government, which is part of Henry VII's legacy. Now that legacy and that monarchy was further strengthened by this guy. Everybody knows who he is, Henry VIII. We know that he was the father of Elizabeth I, and we know that he's probably most famous for his institution of the Church of England, the creation of the Anglican Church. He asked for, essentially asked for a divorce from Rome. He said, I don't like this Catherine of Aragon woman, she can't give me a son. They said, too bad you can't divorce her. He constructed various arguments about why the marriage wasn't valid in the first place, and finally, out of desperation, he said, look, I'll start my own church, and I'll marry this Anne Boleyn woman. I'll divorce Catherine, and I'll marry Anne Boleyn. And as a result, we get the Church of England. Although Henry himself was not really a Protestant. He still remained a Catholic, it is said, until his death. There's some suggestion that he might have converted to Protestantism on his deathbed. Nobody's really sure. This creates obviously it creates in England what will hereafter be religious controversies between Protestants and Catholics that will recur, at least until the English Civil War, and won't be resolved fully for some time. But by and large, Henry, despite being an autocratic ruler, was nevertheless generally regarded as quite a stable king, and was quite a stable monarchy. So again, the Tudor monarchs, generally speaking, are seen as relatively skilled politically, except for some of them. For example, Henry's son, who takes the throne at the age of 9. It's misleading to say that Edward VI takes the throne at the age of 9 because England is run by a regent, that is to say a council of nobles who basically set their own agenda, because he dies at the age of 15 and never really puts his stamp on the monarchy because he's simply not old enough. Okay, but he was pro-Protestant, but it wasn't a very good period historically for England. It was a bit of a setback in terms of the Tudor legacy. And then, of course, the biggest setback of all was Queen Mary, whose nickname or epithet was Bloody Mary, which suggests that maybe she wasn't very nice, and she had about 300 people burned at the stake for being what she called heretics. She reversed England's religious policy, went back to Catholicism, and rather zealously rooted out what she saw as anti-Catholic ministers or anti-Catholic spokespersons and had them basically burned at the stake. So she persecuted Protestants, hence the name Bloody Mary. The most infamous cases involve what were known as the Oxford Martyrs, a guy named Hugh Latimer and another guy named Nicholas Ridley, who spoke out against her religious policy and were burned at the stake as a result. Generally speaking, however, the Tudor monarchy was a stable one, and generally speaking, from a kind of constitutional historical vantage point, it was seen to have really been quite a stable period, a modernizing period, a period that would bring England and bring the English state into the modern period as a kind of consolidated whole. The general backdrop here is the birth of the nation state. In Europe, for example, in 1648, we have the end of the 30 Years' War, with the signing of what are called the Treaties of Westphalia. This is generally seen in international relations as the period in which the modern period of sovereignty begins. So this is where England is heading. But England is also heading, we now know with benefit of hindsight, towards a civil war. So really Shakespeare's life, the time in which Shakespeare exists, is framed by two periods of fundamental political instability in England. One, the War of the Roses, which comes before his birth and death. And then, of course, after his death, the English Civil War. So Shakespeare exists in between these two. One could argue that the Tudors, these skilled monarchs who were able to hold these precarious emerging balances, these powers in Britain in balance, in England in balance, just long enough for the Tudor kings to come along, the Stuart kings, to come along and screw the whole thing up. So that's the context that we're dealing with here. So what happens under the Tudor monarchies, it's clear that three contending centers of power have now emerged in the medieval constitution that need to be dealt with. One is, of course, monarchical government. We have kings and queens who claim that they are the center of authority. But they also have to deal with this reality that there's this thing now called Parliament, which sees itself as the authority, or perhaps the lone authority, or should be seen as the lone authority in political matters. And of course, we've got the tradition of the common law. So, as far as the medieval constitution is concerned, we've got these three contending centers. Where does sovereignty reside? Where is it located? This, of course, is a fundamental issue for a guy named Thomas Hobbes, who writes a book in 1651 called Leviathan that we're not reading, but deals very directly, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, by the way, it deals very directly with these issues. Well, one thing's for sure, because these issues are unresolved, because it's not clear where sovereignty resides, it's going to take a fairly skilled ruler to hold these precarious forces in a workable balance. And by and large, with the exceptions I've noted, the Tudor monarchs were able to do that. And so you couldn't have effective rule unless you acknowledged that these centers existed. But you also had to achieve balance now in the religious sphere, because we've got this ongoing problem between Catholics and Protestants. How are we going to deal with that? One way to deal with that is to kill all the Catholics. Another way to deal with that is to kill all the Protestants. This does not seem ideal. So from a political vantage point, you've got a situation in which you've got to deal with the reality now of the Protestant versus the Catholic division. And from a ruler's point of view, you've got to deal with that in a manner that's politically expedient. Okay, the Tudor monarchs, so by and large, with the obvious exception of Bloody Mary, were able to do that, and especially Elizabeth I. She was particularly good at maintaining these balances. So there's kind of broad political overview for Shakespeare's life. And then along come the Stuarts. We know that history has not treated them anywhere near as kindly as far as constitutional historians are concerned as it does the Tudor monarchs. The first of the Stuart monarchs, of course, is James I, who was described, or saw himself, as a man of great cultural refinement, a man who loved to wax philosophical, a man who loved his books, a man who preferred study to politics, a man who in many respects resembles Prospero, in some respects resembles a kind of Plato or a kind of Platonic philosophical ruler, at least he perhaps fancies himself as that. A man who loved to talk about the divine right of kings. Gee, go figure, a king who loves to talk about this doctrine called the divine right of kings. A man who loved to talk about the divine right of kings to anybody who would listen, including Parliament, who weren't particularly interested in hearing about the divine right of kings because they saw themselves as the new emerging political force in England. He's been described by one historian as a scholar of more learning than discretion. In other words, politically speaking, he wasn't very wise. He wasn't very pragmatic. Again, he liked to speak about divine power as if he existed in a vacuum, as if Parliament and the common law did not exist. So he saw his power as absolute. He saw his power as indivisible. But the reality is there were these other forces around him. And, he comes to the throne in 1603. In 1605, there's an attempt to kill him. It's called the Gunpowder Plot in November of 1605. Had the Gunpowder Plot have succeeded, the Guy Fawkes plot, if you will, it would have killed not just the king, but the entire English establishment. The entire English political establishment would have been in the building when it blew up. But it was discovered. It was discovered, and they literally caught Guy Fawkes red-handed. They caught him with the fuses and with the explosives. It has been said that James I had a reckless authoritarian style. In other words, he was a little bit like a bull in a china shop. He liked to talk about his power. He liked to talk about the indivisibility and the absolute nature of his power, again, against political realities that suggested maybe his power was neither absolute nor indivisible. And yet, in spite of all this, he wasn't as politically challenged as his son, Charles I, who also enjoyed talking about his power, and brings the crown, brings the government of the king into even sharper conflict with Parliament and the common law. And of course, in our quick and dirty history of English constitutional politics, we know that this eventually helped to create a civil war that started in 1642 and ended with the king losing his head. Ended with the execution of the king, which is quite a dramatic moment in English constitutional history. And not that far removed from Shakespeare's life. It doesn't happen that long after Shakespeare's death. So again, Shakespeare's life is framed by these rather momentous political developments in terms of constitutional history. Now, one thing that has been said about Elizabeth's reign is it created a relative degree of artistic freedom for Shakespeare and for other artists. But that's not to say that there weren't problems, because there certainly were. We're not talking about our kind of society, which also has censorship and also has problems. When I say religious, characterized by relative religious toleration, toleration isn't quite the right word here, because even if Elizabeth herself were tolerant of religious differences, Elizabethan society was intolerant. It wasn't a good time to be a monarch. It wasn't a good time to be a minority, because of the tyranny of majority opinion. So even if the monarchs themselves could be said to be relatively enlightened and progressive and tolerant, society at large, generally speaking, wasn't. But what was pragmatic and I think quite skillful and savvy about this monarch is she said, look, religious matters we're talking about Christian religious matters here, okay? We're talking about Protestants versus Catholics. And we have now an Anglican queen who says, look, as far as religious matters go, these are matters of the heart. I ask only for outward conformity. If you're a Catholic and you have a little shrine in your home and you want to undertake Catholic worship privately, that's fine. Don't do it publicly. So she asked only for outward conformity to the law. Shakespeare's own father appears to have been a Catholic. He appears to have run afoul of the authorities. He appears to have had to pay some fines because of this. But he wasn't persecuted in the way that Bloody Mary persecuted Protestants. But Shakespeare himself is often seen to be a kind of pro-Catholic conservative because his father was generally taken to have been a Catholic. Of course, there was a time in England when everybody was a Catholic, so that's not surprising. Now, this is a wonderful comment by Elizabeth I that I think really clearly demonstrates her pragmatism. She says, I refuse to make windows into men's souls. There is only one Jesus Christ, and all the rest is a dispute over trifles. So in other words, there's great pragmatism here. Let's recognize that we're all Christians living in a Christian commonwealth or a Christian realm, and let's understand that, and let's not return to the persecutions of the past. And that's not to say that she couldn't be authoritarian and autocratic and unpleasant and didn't kill people, because she did. In fact, the Tudor monarchs all set up this great extrajudicial body called the Star Chamber, which would routinely interview people and torture them. But calibrated against other monarchies, it wasn't actually all that bad. In other words, what they brought was stability to the realm. And generally speaking, she was a popular monarch, despite an attempt late in her reign to kill her, which we'll mention briefly in a minute. So unlike much of Europe, England actually goes through a fairly raucous historical period, more or less intact, and enjoys a period of relative peace and prosperity and cultural revival, especially under the reign of Elizabeth I. And the fact that England emerges victorious from the attempted and abortive invasion of the Spanish Armada in 1588 has a lot to do with this. It sets the tone for the years that will follow. It helps to boost national spirits and the economy. It cements and clearly crystallizes England's naval supremacy, which would grow and grow in the years afterwards. So English power, once Britain emerges as once Britain emerges as an imperial power, it's pretty clear that the heart of that power is the Navy. And it begins in earnest after the defeat of the Spanish Armada. And what happens is Europe, where things aren't quite as good, we get a number of political refugees from Europe who find their way to London. So London becomes the hub of Elizabethan civilization, its center. And at the heart of that is this pleasure-loving court of the Elizabethan queen. And it's an atmosphere really in which artistic pursuits, in which theater could thrive, and indeed does begin to thrive. So it's against this general backdrop that emerges Shakespeare and, of course, the other playwrights. One of the things that enhances Shakespeare's perhaps surprising artistic liberty is the location of the theatres in a part of London called Southwark. In a part of London south of the Thames, in what is today Surrey, not that Surrey, but Surrey in England. And the location of the theatres and other things, like the bear-baiting pits and prisons and brothels, all sorts of pursuits that might be considered by Puritans to be, the wrong kinds of pursuits. South of the river is important because the London Council is now dominated by Puritans, and it's the Puritans that will be thrown into conflict with Charles I in the English Civil War. So the location of the theatres really moves them outside of the direct control of the London Puritan-dominated council. So this itself enhances artistic freedom. There's a kind of not very good picture of the Globe Theatre, and this is a bear baiting pit. That's a bear being attacked by dogs. So now you know why there are no bears in England anymore, because they were killed off on bear baiting exercises. Here's a map of London circa 1600, so you have a sense of what I mean by the spatial demarcation of the theatre. Here we have the Globe. Here we have other theatres. We have bear pits. We have the Clink, where some of my relatives or ancestors spent some time. The word the Clink as a kind of euphemism for prison is still around today. So as you can see, this was kind of an area of London where you went if you wanted to have some fun. Okay, but you brought along some protection when you went there. And here's the Puritan-dominated part of London. This is where, again, this area becomes known as the Southwark Liberties, which is an interesting way of phrasing it. And yet, having said that, Shakespeare's, he didn't write his plays entirely at liberty. All plays had to be licensed by a bureaucratic agent who was created by the Tudor monarchs called the Master of the Revels. So the Master of the Revels had to go through every play, or authorities working the Revels office had to go through every play, and they had to authorize it. And sometimes bits of plays were rejected. Sometimes they didn't make it past the censors. So censorship occurred. For the most part, however, the government took a hands-off policy toward the stage. This was true of both Elizabeth and James I. Now, a clever playwright could probably slip some political stuff in there without it being noticed. I want to suggest that Shakespeare's a very clever playwright. But again, whether or not he intended for this final play to be as political as I think it is another story. We'll see. Now, this aside, there was a time in 1603 where Shakespeare runs into some fairly serious trouble. A representative of the Lord Chamberlain's men is called before this extrajudicial body called the Star Chamber and asked to explain why he suddenly decided on February 6, 1603, to put on a production of Richard II and reintroduce a scene in which the king is actually deposed, a scene that was seen as too controversial to show in the past because it might suggest that the sitting monarch, this time Elizabeth I, should herself be deposed. And it was the intention of the Earl of Essex, who was trying to depose the Queen and tried to do so the next day, disastrously, I might add, ended very badly for him. Nevertheless, an agent for the Earl of Essex approached Shakespeare's company on the night of February 6, 1603, and said, "I'll give you 40 shillings if you reinsert the part of the play where the king is deposed." And they said, "Okay." And they took the money. Now, Shakespeare himself is relatively unscathed by this because 2 or 3 days later he's back on the stage, so nothing seems to have come of it. So whatever was said by this representative of the Lord Chamberlain's men when he appeared at Star Chamber satisfied them. He basically said, "We did it for the money, Gov." And they said, "Okay, don't do it again." Okay, so there were times when Shakespeare ran afoul of the authorities. One of the things that this story demonstrates is it demonstrated that Shakespeare was aware of the political significance of theater. So that in itself, I think, is significant. We know that Elizabeth liked plays. We know that James liked plays. This play was a Jacobean play, so we'll talk more about James now. It is said that James loved the theater. He loved it so much that he didn't really attend plays. The plays attended him. In other words, he was particularly fond of the masque and court spectacle and pageantry, and he would love it when the plays would come to him, when the playwrights would come to him with their plays, and The Tempest seems to have been written to satisfy this desire. The Tempest is a multimedia play. It's full of music. It's full of dance. It's full of pageantry. And the king loved that. And he loved to have the plays performed for him. So we can easily imagine, and we know that The Tempest was performed for James I, how wonderful to imagine that under his very nose he was being attacked. That his rule was possibly being attacked in a way that would have been quite seditious. And mutinous is what I want to suggest in this lecture. The second part of this lecture deals with what we could call the problem of meaning. It has been said, this is a quote about Shakespeare's plays I like, if Shakespeare's plays have meaning, it has been made too elusive to allow for complete agreement over what it is. Okay, for one thing, again, this brings the issue of authorial intention back into play. What is it that Shakespeare intended? Well, we don't know. Because for one thing, Shakespeare was very good at dramatizing problems, but not very good at resolving them. Now, maybe he didn't want to resolve them. So maybe when he says of maybe when we have Prospero say of Caliban that this is a demi-devil on whom nurture cannot stick, that's one view. This is a play about nature and nurture, and we have Prospero saying that Caliban is by nature evil and cannot be educated. And yet later on in the play we have Prospero say of Caliban, this thing of darkness I acknowledge mine. Does that mean that he, Prospero, recognizes that Caliban is not in fact innately evil, but a product of his creation? Well, the play itself never resolves this. Just as Shakespeare's plays very seldom resolve the kinds of dualisms that they introduce. So one of the dualisms at the heart of this play is nature versus nurture. But it's not resolved. Again, Shakespeare's a dramatist. He dramatizes the problems. He doesn't resolve them for us. But it may be that there are hints as to what his ultimate view is if we read the play carefully enough. Or it may be that subconsciously Shakespeare is resolving issues and that we're able, with exploration, to figure out what he wants to ultimately say. Now, the problem of meaning becomes a special problem in The Tempest because the play is clearly allegorical. That's one area of agreement. The play is allegorical. In other words, that this opening storm stands for something. It's been taken in a number of different directions. I mean, you could take a Freudian reading of the storm. You could take a psychological reading of the storm. You could say it represents some kind of inner psychological turmoil. The storm represents artistic turmoil. The storm might represent political turmoil. That's obviously the direction that I'm going to head in. So we've got an allegory here. The question is, what is it meant? How is it meant to function? There's also generic problems with this play. How do we classify this play? Is it a comedy? Is it a romance? Is it a drama? Nobody dies in the play, despite efforts to the contrary. I mean, there's an attempt to kill Prospero. There's some fairly unpleasant behavior. There's some murderous intention, but nobody actually dies in this play. It doesn't look like a straightforward tragedy. It doesn't look like a straightforward comedy. Moments of the play are remarkably funny. But there are also some very dark aspects to this play. So, generically speaking, what kind of a play is it? Well, there are a number of Shakespearean plays that can't be easily classified, so they're called problem plays. This is not, in fact, one of the problem plays. This is usually classified as a romantic comedy. So what happens with a play like The Tempest, this final play, is it actually needs its own new generic category because it's got this kind of hybrid character to it. We're not entirely sure what to make of it. We don't even know if it's a good play. Critics are divided on this. Some critics say it's a very bad play. Shakespeare himself might have regarded it as a bad play. You know, as my colleague Globerman once pointed out to me, there are a couple of references to foul play in this play. Is this a play on words? Is Shakespeare saying, this is a foul play, I don't like this play, it's not my favorite play? Maybe Shakespeare himself didn't like it. So, these are related issues. We know it's allegorical. We know it's open to a wide range of interpretations. I'm going to deal with a few of them, and then I'm going to give you mine. Now, there are two views of the play that persist among other views. One, that it's a play about plays. That it's a commentary on theater itself. Or as they say in English departments, it's a work of meta-theater. It's a meta-theatrical play. And another fairly dominant line of interpretation, especially from the 1950s onward with the beginning of what's called the post-colonial movement of the world, is that this is a play about colonization. That this is an early exploration of Jacobean colonial policy. The play is first put on in 1611, and we know that by 1607 the Virginia colony is up and running. So we know that colonization is occurring. We know that when there are these allusions to dead natives being brought back to London, or live natives from America being brought back to London and put on display, there are allusions to this in the play. This is a real historical practice. So there is a real early stage of English imperialism going on here. So it is theoretically possible that Shakespeare's commenting on that. It's not accidental. The play, of course, is not set in the New World, although when we think about The Tempest, we probably think of it as somehow set in the New World, and that's probably because of the strong influence of post-colonial interpretations, which very often set the play in the Caribbean. But it's actually set, well, it's kind of set nowhere, but if you really want a kind of spatial setting for it, it's the Mediterranean, it's not the New World. Nevertheless, the play appears to raise questions about the colonizer, and the colonizer, we need to say something about that. Let's deal first with meta-theater. We can deal relatively briefly with this. I've seen entire lectures devoted to the idea that this is a play about theater. It's obviously an interpretation that works, but it's an interpretation that works so well that I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on it. For one thing, okay, it's a play about plays, but aren't all of Shakespeare's plays about plays? Doesn't Shakespeare generally take the line that all the world's a stage? You'll remember that Mark Globerman talked earlier about that in the context of Oedipus, the 7 ages of man, this very famous extended monologue from Shakespeare in which he talks about, all the world the stage from As You Like It. So that's a sort of standard Shakespearean line. In virtually every Shakespeare play, we can see evidence of meta-theatricality. Is it more pronounced in this play? Possibly so. But it's part of what Shakespeare's all about. But what makes this play special is that Shakespeare is not just talking about the relationship between, I think my thing's dying here. He's not just talking about the relationship between theater and life, and his ability as an artist to collapse that distinction. He's also saying goodbye. And we have plenty of evidence that this play is a valediction. This is a playwright saying, okay, I'm retiring now. I'm going back to the country. I'm going to start thinking of putting my affairs in order. And ultimately we have Prospero, if indeed he speaks for Shakespeare. And this line suggests that he does. The meta-theatrical line sees Prospero speaking not for James I, not for Plato, but for Shakespeare. And he's saying goodbye. Right? I'm going to bury my books. I'm going to take my magic, my theatrical magic, and I'm going to set it aside. It's time to move on. Again, an interpretation that quite clearly works. If you're interested in this interpretation, here's where you'll find strong evidence to support it. I'm not going to read through this because you can do that on your own. You probably already have. So we have this very famous scene in which Prospero says, our revels now are ended. On one level, he's referring to the mask that he's just put on for the upcoming wedding of his daughter. But on another level, this is Shakespeare saying to the audience, I'm done. It's been fun. But, these actors you see are merely players. It's not real. The real world beckons all of us. See you later. And again, in these other, now my charms are all overthrown. My theatrical charms are gone. My theatrical powers are gone. It's time to move on. Again, it's very tempting to read the play this way. And I think you can read the play this way. Maybe you should read the play this way, but it's not the only way you can read this play. So it could be a glorious autobiographical farewell disguised as a play, but it could be much more. And I want to suggest it's much more. Now this other line, this post-colonial line, at least has the virtue of seeing the play politically. But it sees the play politically in a very narrow way. We have this claim by Caliban, who says, this isle is mine by Sycorax my mother, which thou takest from me. This is a very powerful claim. This is a claim not unlike the claims made by First Nations. I lived here, I was happy, you came, you took it. It's mine. It's a constitutional claim. This island's mine by Sycorax my mother, which thou takest from me. This is a claim that's going to require a response. Now the only response that Caliban gets is, thou most lying slave. You're lying. But that response is coming from Prospero, so we don't know whether Prospero is telling the truth. He's unlikely to be objective, let's put it that way. Because Prospero's come along and said, look, when I found you, you couldn't even speak. Thou didst gabble like a thing most brutish. You couldn't even put two words together. Now, is it possible that Caliban couldn't speak, or is it possible that Caliban spoke his own native dialect that looked like non-speech to Prospero? See, these possibilities are here in the play. So clearly, one way we could read the play is an early exploration of this kind of colonial problem. One thing's for sure, this is a claim here that requires a response. It probably requires a deeper, more satisfactory response than the one that Caliban gets. And this becomes a major theme in post-colonial readings. Where various writers have wanted to see the play as an exploration of colonial politics and then apply it to their own situations. Again, this has been particularly strong in Caribbean politics and Caribbean interpretations and analyses. So was Shakespeare himself an early critic of colonial policy? Some readings suggest yes, some readings suggest no. He was an apologist. He was an apologist for Jacobean colonial policy. He liked it. He thought it was fine. He's not commenting critically on it at all. I would suggest he is. I would suggest to the extent that Shakespeare is interested in this as an issue, and I don't think it's his central issue, I would say that he's probably more on Caliban's side than he is on Prospero's. Now, what would make me say that? Well, for one thing, we know that Shakespeare thought a great deal of Montaigne, a humanist whose essay appears in the back of the Florio edition of The Tempest. We have a character named Gonzalo who actually parrots almost line for line part of this essay. We don't need to know a great deal about Montaigne to make this interpretation work. We know he was a humanist. We know that he said that there's more barbarism in eating a man alive than in eating him after he's dead. And what he meant by that in this essay is that colonial policy eats men alive. At least these natives who you abhor have the decency to kill somebody before they eat them. So what we have in Montaigne, somebody who's influential for Shakespeare, somebody whom Shakespeare relies on, especially in this play, is a line of analysis that seems quite sympathetic to the plight of Caliban. And as we know, Caliban is an anagram on what would have then been an acceptable spelling of the word cannibal. So we've got this is some, not overpowering evidence, but some evidence that Shakespeare's sympathies might reside with Caliban. There are other things that we might include as evidence. For example, Prospero and Miranda. They see their mission with Caliban as educational. He hasn't asked for their education. He hasn't asked for their dubious love. They give it nonetheless. We see Miranda saying some remarkably unpleasant things. This is a 15-year-old girl whose experience with the world seems fairly substantial for a 15-year-old girl, whose language is very questionable for a 15-year-old girl. It's really quite unpleasant, especially to Caliban. Not that there are many other people around. If this is an educational mission that Prospero with Miranda have undertaken with Caliban, they're highly suspect teachers. They've taught him some very strange things. For one thing, they've taught him that he's a nothing. He's an insignificant nothing. I mean, there's virtually no dialogue in the play that involves Caliban that doesn't begin with "thou most lying slave," "thou abhorred slave," "thou earth," "thy dirt." You are filth. And this is over and over and over again. Now, I don't know about you, but if you're raising young children or raising young Calibans, maybe you're giving them an inferiority complex by referring to them as vile and dirt and filth and evil every single time that they, come to see you. There's plenty of evidence that that's how they treat him. Now, there's also evidence that maybe he deserves to be treated badly, but it's left at least ambiguous. We have some religious instruction that comes from Prospero, but it's not Christian. It's not Christian religion. He teaches him a pagan story about the man in the moon, which has very amusing consequences later in the play, when Caliban takes Trinculo and Stefano as men who have come from the moon. Right? So this is interesting. If there are colonizers in the play, maybe they're not Prospero, maybe they're Stefano and Trinculo. They're the colonizers. Well, if they're the colonizers, it's impossible for me to believe that Shakespeare's trying to say something positive about the mission or the colonizing or so-called civilizing mission that's going on here. Well, let's go back to that. For one thing, Stefano and Trinculo, what is it that they introduce Caliban to? Alcohol. And they do it in the context of the Bible. One of the few references in the play to the Christian Bible comes from Stefano and Trinculo, where they say, "Here, kiss the book," an allusion to the Bible, and give him alcohol. So what's going on with these characters is the Bible and alcohol are being brought together. And it seems that the only thing that Stefano and Trinculo are able to give Caliban are diseases, alcohol, and a new master, but a new master who's probably even worse than the old one. But Caliban, in his desperation, sees them as superior, at least to Prospero. And we know that Caliban, it's been said many times, Caliban speaks some of the most beautiful lines in the play. Especially these lines, "Be not afeard, the isle is full of noises," which again you can read on your own. And you're free to agree or disagree that these are beautiful lines. But they're lines spoken by Caliban, which is quite remarkable. And we also know that Caliban at least has a constitutional argument in favor of what is alleged to be his most heinous crime. And that, of course, is his alleged attempted rape of Miranda. Prospero says, "You tried to meddle with my daughter." And what does Caliban say? He doesn't say, "No, I didn't." He says, "Whoa, whoa, ho, whoa, ho, would it had been done. I wish I had. Thou didst prevent me." What does he say next? "I peopled else this isle with Calibans." So he doesn't say you're lying. He doesn't say you're wrong. He doesn't deny the charge. But he doesn't seem to regard it as rape, because I think he sees himself as existing in a kind of state of nature. He doesn't recognize Prospero's rule as legitimate. He thinks he's still living on his own island, and therefore he's not under any constraint. He's just acting on natural urges. So that's one part of the response. The other part of the response is a political response. "I peopled else this isle with Calibans." Well, what do we know about Caliban? We know he's outnumbered. He's outnumbered by Prospero, his invisible secret police, who Caliban doesn't know about, Ariel, and of course he's outnumbered by Prospero and Miranda together. That's a 2-to-1 ratio. But if he could people else the isle with Calibans, then he'll be numerically preponderant. And the only claim to authority and legitimacy here is numerical preponderance. So he gives a nice political response. It's an ugly accusation, but he gives it a political resonance. He says, look, woe ho, would it had been done, thou didst prevent me, I'd peopled else this isle with Calibans, and then I would outnumber you, and it really would be my island. So these are all things that we could take as at least things that we could say fall on Caliban's side of the ledger in terms of sympathies. But again, Shakespeare doesn't resolve it. Again, we see this dualism. You taught me language, and my prophet on it is I know how to curse. And then, of course, he immediately goes on to curse. Now, what, of course, is pathetic about Caliban's curse is they have no chance of coming true. He doesn't have the power to back the words. A red plague curse you for teaching me your language. We know that that's not going to get any traction because he's not a magician the way that Prospero is. So we have this, you taught me language and my prophet honors, I know how to curse. This is nurture. You have made me what I am. If I don't satisfy you, master, it's because you made me what I am. Then we have this other claim, a devil, a born devil, on whose nature nurture can never stick. This is the opposite claim. He's just innately evil. He's a devil. And no devil can be taught. He's an experiment gone wrong. I could never get anywhere with this guy. He was just innately evil. Again, this is not resolved. Why is it not resolved? Because Shakespeare, for one thing, perhaps doesn't know how to resolve it. That maybe this is part of the message for Shakespeare, is that, there is this irresolvable dualism at the heart of the human condition. It's not just an issue of colonial policy. Is man an angel and a god, or is he a devil? And of course, we see this very clearly in some of Shakespeare's best-known plays. In Hamlet, we have these very famous lines from Hamlet when he says to Rosencrantz, what a piece of work is a man. What a wonderfully ambiguous line, and the lines that flow from it. Because piece of work, first of all, you've all heard the expression piece of work. He's a real piece of work. She's a real piece of work. But it wasn't originally meant to be negative. Oh, what a piece of work is a man. It's only an intonation, you see. What a piece of work is a man, says Hamlet. What a piece of work is a man. How, in reason, how noble. And how admirable. How like a god. I'm paraphrasing. This isn't line for line. But then he turns it all around and says, and yet man delight me not. Or what is this quintessence of dust that we call a human being? He reverses it. So what we've got in Hamlet and in Shakespearean theater in general, one could argue, is an ambiguity, a fundamental ambiguity. Are we a devil? Are we a god? Is Caliban innately evil? Is he good? And has he been corrupted? Where do we reside? We seem to reside somewhere in between for Shakespeare. Now, the resonance, this line, what a piece of work is a man, what's stuck with us over the years is the idea that we're a piece of work in the negative way. But in typical Shakespeare style, and maybe this is just, maybe this is the atmosphere of the age, it's not resolved. Man delights me not. Now don't, if you're offended by the reference to men, he then says, nor woman neither. So you don't get off the hook, because Hamlet's not delighted in women either, he says. I would suggest before the break that whatever its ultimate meaning, this play is full of political issues, and political themes dominate this play. Whatever its ultimate intentions, those issues are there. And I think they go way beyond post-colonial readings. They're too narrow for my liking. I think there's more to it than this. And I think that Shakespeare's critique is either secretive and cautious and encoded. We do have these allusions, these references. If Shakespeare is Prospero, or if Prospero speaks for Shakespeare, or sometimes speaks for Shakespeare, which may be the case, well, we know that Prospero was engaged in secret studies. So is Shakespeare saying, I too am engaged in secret studies? That there may be an encoded message in this play that you can find. Some Shakespeare critics have taken that line. It's not necessarily my line, but I am at least partly inspired in this reading, in this lecture, by a book called Shakespeare and the Good Life by a Shakespeare critic called David Lowenthal, who takes the view that Shakespeare is a philosopher and that he's writing a kind of Platonic philosophy that goes back hundreds of years, and that he's part of a kind of secret club of philosophers. I'll say more about that after the break. And that this is a deliberately seditious play. I would say that it's possibly a seditious and mutinous play, but I don't know that it's deliberate, and I certainly don't agree with the thesis that Lowenthal promotes, which I'll talk about later on. But suffice it to say that there are plenty of reasons to think that this is a more political and more generally political play than some lines of analysis suggest, whether or not Shakespeare intends it to be so. Now let me turn to the Tempest and politics in the 7 minutes remaining before the break and start to develop this line of analysis for you. First of all, I would suggest that from the very beginning of the play, it's a political play that raises fundamental political questions. Let's turn to that part of the play. Page 97. So we have a storm. We have a boat in a storm. And the first line of the play is spoken by the master of the ship, who says, "Boatswain!" And no, that word is not pronounced boatswain. It's boatswain. "Here, master, what cheer?" "Good! Speak to the mariners, fall to yerly, or we run ourselves aground. Bestir, bestir," enter the mariners. And the boatswain turns to the mariners and says, "Hey, my hearts, cheerly, cheerly, my hearts, yer, yer, take in the topsail, tend to the master's whistle." And then he turns to the storm and says to the storm, "Blow till thou burst thy wind, if room enough." And then we have the nobles entering. "Good boatswain, have care." Now, there's no reason to think that the boatswain has anything but care. So this first line to the boatswain is rather strange. "Good boatswain, have care." Where's the master? A very good question. We have a ship in a storm. One would expect the master to be somewhere. But we don't actually know where the master's gone. He speaks to the boatswain. He says to the boatswain, "Take care of the ship." And then he becomes a whistle as opposed to a master. And then these nobles turn to the mariners and say, "Play the men." Now there's tremendous irony here, because the nobles are the ones that aren't playing the men. In other words, "Be manly," say the nobles, but the nobles are chicken shits. They're terrified. In fact, the first of the nobles overboard is who? Who is the first of all that flees? Who is the first one into the water? I'll give you a hint. Someone falls in love with him. Okay, he's the first one overboard. He's not hanging around. We learn later in the play that he just jumps overboard. So we have these nobles who are terrified, who are saying to these men, talk about projection, they're saying to these mariners, "Listen, you chickens, get us through this." There's no reason to think that these mariners are anything but brave, because they're fighting the storm and they're doing their job. And the nobles are meddling in their job. And the boatswain says, "I pray now, keep below." That's a nice political resonance, that claim. Keep below. Get down below. Get where you belong. Get under the decks. Then Antonio says again, "Where is the master, boatswain?" "Do you not hear him?" says the boatswain. "You mar our labor. Keep your cabins. You do assist the storm." In other words, you're making our job difficult. You're helping the storm screw the ship. The ship's going to sink if you don't get out of here. It may sink anyway, but you're going to make it worse because you're interfering with our jobs. "Nay, good, be patient," says Gonzalo. "When the sea is," says the boatswain. "Hence, what care these roars for the name of a king? To cabin, silence, trouble us not." What care these roars for the name of a king? Gee, I wonder if I could read that line seditiously, as mutinously, as political. Now, in 1651, we have this book by Thomas Hobbes called Leviathan. It's not that long after Shakespeare lives and dies. And in this text, in this very famous book, this book that is near and dear to the hearts of political scientists, we have a reference to the seditious roaring of a mob, which Hobbes compares to the sea. Okay, he says right out, he says it's like the seditious, he said the sea can be compared to the mob, the seditious roaring of a troubled nation. So, you know, we have these waves that together constitute a kind of uproar, a kind of roar. We know that the sea has this noise quality to it. It roars. Now we've got this wonderfully, potentially seditious line. What care these waves, these roars, for the name of a king? To cabin, silence, trouble us not. Good, yet remember whom thou hast aboard. And I love the response the boatswain gives. None that I love more than myself. Now it's terrific that he says that, because it's a great, first of all, it's a great Hobbesian response. And also, Gonzalo is smart enough to pick up on what this implies. It implies that should the boatswain be as self-interested as he claims, that's good news for all of us, because this man is fated to hang, says Gonzalo, because he's so impudent. And that means that he becomes our lifeline. So maybe we should go below decks and let him do his work. Okay? So it's, you know, it goes on and on like this. None that I love more than myself. We have the bosun, that's probably enough for now. We have the bosun accused of being a drunk. There's no evidence to suggest that he's a drunk. We have him accused of being a coward. There's no evidence to suggest he's a coward. But we do have these, we'll come back to that later, but we do have some interesting political questions raised right at the start of the play, if we read it carefully. And one of those questions is, who should rule? Who should rule? Nobles? You know, this question of worth is one of the most important questions that Hobbes will raise in the Leviathan. He says, who should rule, says Hobbes. You know, he says a corrupt judge is worth much in times of war, but in times of peace, we want our judges to be honest. In the middle of a war, you know, it's good to have lots of officers around, but in times of peace, we don't need lots of officers. So in other words, who should rule is a function of the kind of world we live in. And the kind of world that these nobles live in is not the kind of world, perhaps, that the bosun and perhaps Shakespeare is living in. The bosun comes from amongst the commoners, as does Shakespeare. The bosun says, look, I love myself, but that doesn't mean that I love only myself. But you know what we need right now? The ship is foundering. We need somebody that knows something about the ship and something about how to save a ship. We don't need you. So get below decks. Go back to where you belong at this particular moment. That's below deck. You're assisting the storm. You're marring our labor. In other words, is this a meritocratic argument? That rulership, what constitutes good rulership, depends on the situation. Not on some ascriptive claim about being entitled to rule. Is the person in charge the right one to rule? We have this quite striking scenario here where the master has deputized the bosun, which is very unusual. The bosun is a petty officer in charge of ship maintenance. Now suddenly he's running the ship. The bosun would traditionally be the guy blowing the whistle. In fact, just to prove the point, I went out on the weekend. I live in a maritime community called Steveston, and I bought a bosun's whistle for $14 and spent the weekend trying to learn how to blow it. It was a disaster. So I've given up on blowing you the bosun's whistle. I brought it, and if there's anybody in the room that knows how to blow a bosun's whistle and would like to do so after the break, terrific. I can't figure out how to do it. I sent the dog under the bed, and she hasn't returned. I sent my children into the yard. I sent my wife into hysterics blowing this whistle. And I also partially reduced the hearing in my left ear. And I couldn't get it right. Suffice it to say, it's a very loud whistle. Now, it's called a bosun's whistle because most of the time this whistle, which originates sometime in the 14th century, it would have typically been blown not by the ship's captain, but by the bosun. And yet now we have the master of the ship, the captain, the king, if you will, who's retreated in this kind of, you know, where's he gone? He's become a disembodied whistle. Is this a political illusion? And is what's being suggested here that the person in charge is not necessarily the right person to be in charge? What will qualify a person to rule? Has the ruler become distant? Has he become aloof? Has he become removed? Is this a reference to James I? Does the play begin with an oblique reference to this philosophical king? This philosophical king who loves his libraries more than he loves rulership. My library was dukedom large enough, says Prospero. Does Prospero speak for Shakespeare? That's the valedictorian claim. That's the meta-theory claim. And it is possible that Prospero does speak for Shakespeare. It's also possible that he represents James I. These are not mutually exclusive possibilities. Okay, we'll break there, and we will continue this line of analysis afterward. Thank you. As always, we're in some danger of not having time at the end for questions and maybe even answers. So let's get back at it. Hopefully we will have a little bit of time for that. Okay, so where we left off was talking about what I regard as, in some ways, well, not overt, but a very political beginning to the play, at least the way I read it. Now maybe this is because I'm a political scientist and I'm bound to see things in a political way, but I think we can sustain this analysis, and I want to try to give you some more evidence for this kind of a reading. If I can get this thing to work. Okay. Now, I would argue that there are some political devices at work in this play that Shakespeare is using, again, either subconsciously or otherwise. The first of these political devices is a very familiar metaphor to me. It's called the ship of state. It's familiar to you as well because you've read Plato. And in some ways, Plato is one of the originators of this idea. I mean, you'll recall that Plato loves metaphors. He loves analogies. He talks about rulership in terms of shepherds and sheep. A shepherd, by the way, might have used a whistle. He talks about a ship's master and the crew. Has a nice resonance for us. Again, when Mark talked about Plato, he talked about the state as being, for Plato at least, a kind of collaborative enterprise that resembles an army. We know that life aboard ship, the discipline is absolutely unremitting. We know that in the English Royal Navy it didn't take a lot to be killed. Right? If you've ever seen Mutiny on the Bounty, you'll know what I'm talking about. The master of a ship, master is a good name for the captain of a ship because he's the absolute master of the lives and liberties of his crew. And it's a very, very rigid, at least in the Royal Navy in Shakespeare's day, it would have been an extremely rigid division of labor, an extremely authoritarian type of command aboard ship. To be press ganged, sitting having a beer and suddenly you're in the Royal Navy and your life is completely changed. I mean, it would be quite a thing. So we know that there are these resonances. We know that we have Oedipus who calls himself he sees himself as a ship, or he sees himself as the captain of a ship, and in some regards he sees himself as the ship itself. We have many references in the Greek tragedies to this metaphor, whether it's Creon or whether it's Oedipus. Whether it's Plato, we have these ancient Greek references to the idea of the ship of state. And the ship of state as a metaphor has persisted right up until the present day. A famous English political philosopher named Michael Oakeshott has famously described politics as a ship. He has this metaphor called the boundless sea of politics. And the state is like a ship that sails on this boundless sea, and so on and so forth. So this is a metaphor that is at least familiar to me. And to me, when I think of a ship, I think of politics, and when I think of a ship in a storm, I think of a state in a kind of a political storm. So that's a natural enough association to draw. Now, is Shakespeare using this metaphor? And if he is using it in a Platonic way, or is he using it in a different kind of a way? In other words, would Shakespeare agree that the master of a ship should be in control of the lives and liberties of his crew? Or does he regard the crew as somehow different than Plato does, as having their own interests? In other words, is he more radical and skeptical? Is he using this metaphor in a different way? This is a question that, for me, is worth exploring. Now, if Prospero is meant to be a kind of ship's captain, if we're meant to link this idea of the ship of state to Prospero and his rulership, we can raise some very interesting questions about Prospero as a ruler. I mean, first of all, who are his subjects? At one point, Caliban says to Prospero, I'm all the subjects you have. Now remember, Caliban doesn't know about Ariel. And Prospero's daughter is not really a subject, it's his daughter. So she's part of his ruling team, if you will. Now, here's some recent examples of the ship of state metaphor. There's the ship of state of Iraq, going down hard, looking suspiciously like the Titanic with its 4 funnels. Okay, so there's an example for it. I'm not just making this up. There's somebody trading on this ship of state metaphor. This is a former Iraqi prime minister. We must fight to the death for democracy, right, men? This is Washington crossing the Potomac. And we've got bank fraud and corruption, and I can't quite make that out. Weapons of mass destruction lies. Now who's going to run the ship? Again, this is, abstracting from its context. What we have again is a contemporary use of the ship of state metaphor, in this case to make a kind of a joke. Now what about the state of nature? If you'd read Hobbes or Rousseau or Locke, if you've read any political philosophy, you'll know that modern political philosophy likes this state of nature argument. We even encounter a state of nature argument in Plato's Republic, where Glaucon speculates on the origins of the state. Whether or not Plato takes the state to have always existed, he certainly explores the idea that it might not have, and that it might be a result of some kind of mutual agreement or contract. Now, how does the state of nature argument work? Or how does social contract theory work? It imagines a pre- or non-political situation, a historical or otherwise situation that predates politics or isn't politics, and then says, what are human beings like when they live without a government? And as a result of that exploration, we know what kind of government human beings need. What has this got to do with our play? Well, it might have this to do with our play. The setting or non-setting of the play may function in a kind of state of nature way. In other words, the play isn't really set anywhere. You also know the play takes place in a 24-hour period. And there are some aspects of the play that lend themselves to the possibility that this is all kind of a dream or a fantasy or whatever. But any which way you look at it, what we can say about the play is it represents a kind of suspension from normal reality. A suspension from the normal reality of the world, certainly a suspension from the normal reality of European politics, perhaps. And what we have here is an exploration, then, that Shakespeare has set the play in such a way that it looks like a kind of state of nature, a kind of non-place. In fact, we have this strange dialogue with Gonzalo who says, did you not notice that our clothes were wet a second ago? Now they're not wet anymore. Is that not odd? I mean, there's something odd about this place. Is it real? Is it not real? Is it in the Mediterranean? Does it matter where it is? It's a kind of a non-space or a non-place. And this allows Shakespeare, in a way consistent with the use of a state of nature type argument or a social contract type argument, to say, look, this lets me explore some constitutional possibilities. Again, I'm not saying that he's doing this deliberately. He may or may not be. At least one critic who I'm aware of thinks he is. And like Plato, he presents a number of constitutional possibilities, or we can read the play as presenting a number of constitutional possibilities, which I'll run through in a second. And the play seems to find something wrong with every one of them. Now, the first constitutional possibility we can look at is that this play is a play in defense of Platonic rulership. That Prospero sometimes speaks for Shakespeare, perhaps sometimes represents James I, but also maybe represents Plato. And we know that Shakespeare read Plato. So we've got reason represented by Prospero, we've got appetite represented by Caliban, Miranda. You know what? We're not sure about Miranda. Let's put it this way. Prospero certainly seems worried about Miranda's sexual appetite and the sexual appetite of Ferdinand. And if you read that chess game carefully, he's got good reason to worry. And spirit in the form of Ariel. So we've got Plato's triadic structure here. That's interesting. We've also got somebody whose name begins with P and ends with O. Well, that's extremely tenuous. But nevertheless, Prospero, in many respects, resembles a kind of Platonic ruler. He uses deception. He uses magic to rule. We know that Prospero is obsessed with moderation. This is one of the Platonic obsessions. This is one of the Platonic virtues. But on close inspection, he looks more like a tyrant than a Platonic philosopher. Lots of problems with Prospero's rule. For one thing, he likes to inflict pain. He's figured out what drives Caliban. It's pain, it's deprivation, it's privation, it's fear. Prospero can come across at times as paranoid. Now, it turns out that he does have good reason to worry because there is an actual conspiracy hatched against him that almost succeeds, which is strange, given that it's such a badly conceived conspiracy. And he even fails to anticipate it. In fact, what's interesting about the conspiracy against Prospero is that Caliban, alone among the conspirators, manages to keep his eye on the prize. He manages to understand what they're doing. While these drunks around him, start looting Prospero's stuff. And what does Caliban say? Leave it alone, it's luggage, it's crap, leave it alone. You're forgetting what our plot is. Of course, the plot fails, but it almost succeeds. Now, we're left to wonder if this isn't a parody of a kind of Platonic style of rulership, because Prospero comes across so strangely, in many respects so negatively. Rather than James, is Prospero, at least in terms of this kind of Platonic reading, is Prospero an aloof and distant master? Is this philosophy going wrong? Was he actually usurped? Or was he like that? We know from reading Plato that we're told the philosophical ruler doesn't really want to rule. He wants to sit in his library and he wants to contemplate perfect triangles and perfect circles and the forms. He doesn't want to rule. And again, with Prospero, we have something similar. He doesn't really want to rule. He claims to have been usurped. But he says, the government I cast upon my brother. How is that a usurpation? It's like, if you've read Tennyson's Ulysses, we have Ulysses, who's Odysseus, turning to his son Telemachus and saying, this guy can rule. I don't want to rule. This is my son, my own Telemachus, to whom I leave the scepter in the isle. He's a great bureaucrat. I'm not a bureaucrat. I'm an adventurer. I want to go out and do other things. We've got something similar going on here. We've got this Prospero guy who doesn't appear to want to be a king, and yet he wants to complain about being usurped. But he says quite clearly, the government I cast upon my brother and to my state grew stranger. I alienated myself from my state. Again, my library was dukedom large enough. So there I was, he says, cloaked in secret study. Or he says, to be more accurate, wrapped in secret study. R-A-P-T. But that could be a homonym, as in W-R-A-P-P-E-D, wrapped up in secret study. I too, my state grew stranger. I did this to myself. So Prospero seems to be saying, look, on the one hand, I want to complain that my brother took over my kingdom, but who was going to run it? Now, he didn't realize, he was just an administrator. He was just supposed to be a temporary guy, and then suddenly he becomes the king and I get thrown out. So is this a kind of deflation, a kind of mockery of the Platonic view? Certainly can be read that way. Now, is this also a critique of James? I suggested earlier that it can be read that way. And I want to return to that theme before the end of the lecture. Is Caliban a kind of mini Prospero? And if he is this another deflation of Prospero? Because, as I suggested earlier, what does Caliban do? He mimics Prospero. He's got these spells, I want to have these spells too. He's pathetic in this sense. And in his pathetic nature, he brings Prospero down as well. Because if Caliban is any representation of Prospero's and Plato's educational mission, then he can't really see it in a positive light. Like Plato, he teaches falsehoods. He teaches politically expedient myths. But they don't lead to Caliban's betterment the way they're supposed to, but they lead to his downfall, or to his moral corruption. And finally, we have Prospero in a ship. If you want to return now to this ship of state metaphor, he's exiled in this boat, which he describes, he's in this boat with his little daughter, his 3-year-old daughter, which he describes as a rotten carcass of a butt. The very rats instinctively have quit this boat, says Prospero. In other words, it's barely seaworthy. Is that the kind of Platonic ship of state that we're encountering in this play? So in this line, yes, we can take the line that, this is meant to be a commentary on Platonic philosophy, if it is, and that's a line that is taken by this guy, David Lowenthal, who I mentioned before the break, then it's hard to take it seriously. It seems to be a parody. It seems to be a deflation of Plato, not a kind of glorification of his argument. Another constitutional possibility is that this play presents and rejects the rule of ambitious nobles. Because the play is full of ambitious nobles. The play is full of Machiavelli-styled plots at overthrowing government. Overthrowing government to what end? To my end. To the pursuit of some personal agenda. The way that Essex tries to overthrow Queen Elizabeth I to fulfill a personal agenda. And there are many types of plots going on. This is a play with subplots, both in the ordinary theatrical sense, but also in the political sense. And England has many plots and subplots as well. We've already mentioned the gunpowder plot. I've mentioned Essex's attempt to overthrow the Queen. And there are many more. These ambitious nobles running around trying to turn back the page of English constitutional history. Are these references to these ambitious, power-seeking, unscrupulous nobles an illusion, some kind of illusion to English politics as well? Then, of course, we have this other constitutional model. We could call it the alcoholic monarchy. We could call it the rule of fools that involves Stefano, Trinculo, and Caliban and their plot. On one level, we get some very funny moments. On another level, it's a very sinister plot that they're engaged in, because they do want to drive a nail through the head of Prospero. They want to kill him, or at least Caliban does. So what we have here is we have Caliban, a literal monster, half man, half fish, semi-aquatic, whatever he is. Stefano, a figurative political monster, probably one of the most sinister characters in the play. And then, of course, Trinculo, a literal and figurative fool. He's wearing the jester's motley. He looks like a fool. So literally and figuratively, he's a fool. And they want to rule. But they don't understand. This is mob rule. They don't understand what rulership is. They're so confused about what rulership is that Caliban even manages to construe his enslavement to these very unpleasant characters, especially Stefano, as a kind of freedom. This incredible song that Caliban sings. No more dams I'll make for fish, nor fetching fire in net requiring, nor scrape trenchering, nor wash dish. Ban, bank, Caliban. Got a new master. Get a new man. Freedom, high day, freedom, freedom, high day, freedom. Freedom? You just enslaved yourself to somebody who may wind up being much worse than Prospero. So is this a commentary on the stupidity of the mob, who Rousseau reminds us run constantly towards their chains while calling it freedom? History is full of examples of revolutions that lead to new types of enslavement. Finally, we have Gonzalo's Utopian Paradise, which is based partly on Montaigne, but is also sort of comical and strange. We've got this kind of state of nature situation in which Gonzalo says, isn't it wonderful? Isn't everything wonderful? He makes this kind of philosophical claim that an acre of barren land is worth more than 100 furlongs of sea. That this is a wonderful place. It's a sort of paradise, but it's a paradise that's full of all sorts of unpleasant possibilities. Is this a critique of some of the more optimistic forms of European attitudes towards politics, to what we could call utopian-style thinking? On close inspection, we could say that Plato's argument, too, was a utopian-type argument, not realistic. So I'll leave you to decide that on your own without reading from the play directly here. We talked earlier about the possibility that Shakespeare doesn't really like any of these models, isn't advancing any of them, but is making a very general comment on the human condition, is not necessarily advocating a specific political model, but is taking kind of a middle view. We saw in Hamlet this fairly dramatic example of how he places us, at least, philosophically, he places humanity somewhere between beasts and gods, somewhere between angels and a quintessence of dust, somewhere between Caliban and Ariel. I'm going to have to pick up the pace here if we're going to get through all of this. So my apologies if I'm going too fast for you. One thing that seems clear to me is that political change is in the air. Shakespeare stands on the threshold of what the historian Christopher Hill calls the century of revolution. He dates it right at the beginning of the 1600s, culminating, of course, in the death of a king, the execution in 1649 of Charles I. In 1688, the restoration of the throne, the Glorious Revolution, a tremendous, tumultuous, constitutionally speaking period. So political change is all around. That James I, his politically challenged rule, is going to help to create some of these changes that are going to take root later on in the century. We have this line in the play on page 181. Let's take a look at that, actually. Again, these are lines that are normally read as metatheatrical, starting on page 180. Our revels now are ended. These are actors, as I foretold, we're all spirits. This is the mask coming to an end. And are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the clapped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, the world, the theater, the globe, yea, all which is inherit shall dissolve. And like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. Now, one way to read this is just straight up. This mask, this play, My theatrical art is but an insubstantial pageant that has no real meaning. I'm just an entertainer. I get paid. Give me 40 shillings, I'll stick in whatever you want. Pay, I'll get you some good seats. I'm just an entertainer. It's all for the money. I'm not interested in politics. I'm not interested in anything. It's just an insubstantial pageant. It's got nothing to do with me. I mean, you know, on one hand, the theater is about life, but it's also different from life. I don't think that's the way we should read Shakespeare. I think when Shakespeare says all the world's a stage, what he means is all the world is within the purview of my commentary as an artist. And I don't just need to confine myself to art. I can talk about what I want. But I better be careful how I do it. One way to read this insubstantial pageant is a bit redundant. Because a pageant is insubstantial. It's defined as an empty show of power. That's what a pageant is. We're all familiar with the idea of pomp and pageantry. We've all seen royal weddings. We've all seen that and said, look at the symbols of royal power. But they're empty. And we've got a king named James I who loves pageantry, who loves plays full of pageantry, who loves the masque, who loves music, who loves pomp and circumstance. You recall that picture earlier where he's wearing these ermine robes. He looks a bit like Santa Claus. He's taking himself very seriously. But the reality is his power is substantially eroded by Parliament and the common law. And he doesn't like that. Is he the insubstantial pageant? Is royal power and royal prerogative an insubstantial pageant that is now fading? Is that what Shakespeare is saying? I say yes. You may disagree. But what should take the place of this insubstantial pageant? To go back to the beginning of the play, and in a way the end of the play. Because we have these minor characters who seem to have no business in this play. Just the bosun and his, and the master and the whistle. The master who says literally nothing. Well, he says something. He speaks very... Early on in the play, he speaks and never says another word. And then the bosun and the master reappear at the end of the play. Again, it's only the bosun who speaks. The master at the end is strangely silent. So what is the play promoting? If it's promoting any type of government, is it intentionally or otherwise promoting something along the lines of the kind of governmental structure that the bosun represents? When the bosun speaks to his crew, he doesn't say, look, you dumb little bastards. Look, you vile scum. Thou earth, thou filth, thou most lying slaves. Get to work, you drunken idiots. Is that the way the bosun speaks to his crew? He says, cheerly, cheerly, my men. He's one of them. He comes from among their ranks. He doesn't see himself as superior. He's been deputized by the master, who says, save the ship if you can. But he does it in a way that's collaborative. He treats his crew as equals. The way democratic-style politics, or parliamentary democratic-style politics, treats people not as subjects to be subjected to arbitrary authority, but as citizens. Now if Shakespeare is suggesting this, he's suggesting something that's not only radical, but also seditious and mutinous. I don't know that he's going that far. I'm suggesting the play can be read that way. The bosun, like Shakespeare, comes from amongst the commoners. He's a petty officer. We have this expression in Westminster-style politics. The Prime Minister is described as primus inter pares, first among equals. There's obviously a tension there. How can he be first among equals? Well, it's a bit of a constitutional lie. But the idea is that the cabinet-style government is collaborative government, and that the Prime Minister rules with the advice of those around him. He rules, or she rules, collaboratively. Is the bosun something like, or does he represent something like this kind of a model, this kind of rulership that is in the air, does not yet exist, but is in the air? Now be careful here, because parliamentary-style government is every bit as tyrannical as monarchical government, because what Parliament wants more than anything else is monarchical power. And when Cromwell becomes leader, he declares himself Lord Protectorate and gives himself power so extreme that there's a movement afoot to make him a king. Because making him a king would actually limit his power. But what I'm suggesting is that these are ideas, and that these ideas are in the air. So I'm reading the play in terms of the atmosphere that it's existing in, and not necessarily as part of an open agenda or disguised agenda. One thing remains clear to me, and that's this ship ain't going anywhere without the bosun and his crew. It's not going anywhere. Now, what about a counter-argument to all of these claims? What about the claim that Shakespeare is an apologist for power? What about the perhaps even dominant view that Shakespeare is a crypto-Catholic conservative who, if anything, is on the side of monarchical authority? An apologist for existing power. A conservative. Somebody who buys into the great ideology of Elizabethan politics and life. The great chain of being. The idea that we all have our prescribed role in life. The idea that can still be seen in England today when you go to some of the great manor houses. They have signs on the door that says tradesman's entrance around the rear. Know your place. Know that you do not come through the front door in an aristocratic household if you're just a tradesman. Go to the back. For all I know, this still happens in Vancouver. I've seen, actually, these kinds of signs even here. Tradesmen around the back, please. We don't want the neighbors to know that there are tradespeople working in our house. Stay in your position. The great chain of being has ordained a place for everybody. There's this divinely planned hierarchical order in which everybody has their place, and you are to know your place. Now, if you're interested in this idea, it's actually quite an unusual idea that an object's place in this hierarchical order depends on its relative proportion of spirit and matter. A bit mysterious. But the idea is that everybody stays where they belong. Now let's have a little closer look at this chain of being. It looks like this. So at the top we have God, who is of course totally suffused with spirit. At the bottom we have a complete lack of spirit called rocks. Right? Now if you look at this politically, we've got God, the angels, kings, queens, archbishops, dukes. How far down this line do we have to get before we encounter Shakespeare? There he is. Just above thieves, pirates, gypsies, animals, birds, worms, plants, and rocks. Oh, clearly a self-serving ideology. Obviously, Shakespeare buys into this view because he sees himself as barely better than a thief or a pirate. Well, if Shakespeare accepts this view, it's quite a remarkably self-abnegating view that Shakespeare accepts. And here's a terrific quote. "Unfortunate is the man who does not have anyone he can look down upon." So imagine how the gypsies are feeling in terms of the great chain of being. So I would say it's hard to see Shakespeare as the quote-unquote willing spokesman for the orthodoxy of his age, but he's often seen that way. You could say that the very fact that Shakespeare exists, this non-university educated son of a glover, son of a tradesman, who rises to such incredible heights artistically, intellectually, his very existence is a repudiation of this nonsense. Now, maybe this is why we can't accept, or some of us can't accept, that Shakespeare is who Shakespeare appeared to be. He has to be Francis Bacon. He has to be Edmund de Vere. He has to be an aristocrat. Because it can't be possible that this mere tradesman's son could be William Shakespeare, could rise to this kind of artistic pinnacle and achievement. So you could say the fact he exists is itself a repudiation of this doctrine. A couple of points left to make here. What about the view that I alluded to earlier, represented by a guy named David Lowenthal in his book Shakespeare in the New Life, The Good Life, in which he claims that Shakespeare is a full-blown political philosopher? I'll only say this about the view. I've got two things to say about it. One is that I have relied to some extent on Lowenthal's reading, which I think is very interesting, but I reject its major premise. Its major premise is that Shakespeare is self-consciously engaged in a secret philosophy that goes all the way back to Plato and Socrates. That really, according to this guy, Leo Strauss, a very famous American political philosopher who taught at the University of Chicago and died in 1973, Strauss claims that politics and philosophy are inextricably linked, and that the pivotal moment in the history of Western philosophy, the birth of philosophy, was the death of Socrates. And that from that point forward, politics and philosophy have been involved in a complicated relationship in which those who do philosophy must disguise their philosophical interests, because the very existence of philosophy threatens the atmosphere in which we breathe. In other words, the philosopher, by definition, threatens the established political order and must make his studies secret. And that Shakespeare is one of these philosophers. That Shakespeare is a disciple of Plato. That Shakespeare is speaking through the generations for Plato and through Plato. And he is himself a Straussian philosopher. Not an entertainer, not a playwright, but somebody who is actually devoted to a particular conception of the good life as understood by Strauss. And that's Strauss. Well, that's a picture of Strauss, obviously, when he was young. So Strauss says that ruling should be and is a form of deception. We know that Plato likes deception. That ruling is a secret art. We have this allusion to secret studies in the Tempest, which we're told by Lowenthal, clues us into this reading. We also know, some of you will know, that in recent years Straussians have become famous for another reason, because Paul Wolfowitz and Irving Kristol and prominent American neoconservatives who appeared to be allegedly running the George W. Bush White House were themselves Straussians. And no wonder the George Bush White House was constantly lying to us, because Strauss said we have to lie when we rule. That politically expedient lies is the basis of rulership, because the great unwashed, the masses, aren't ready for this. This is a very conservative argument. It's a very non-Shakespeare type argument. I mean, the reading I've given of Shakespeare, or tried to convince you of, is almost diametrically opposed to this line. This line sees Shakespeare, this new line of Shakespeare criticism, which is interesting, sees him as a philosopher engaged in secret studies, and he's highly conservative. He's speaking a truth, and it valorizes Plato, and it sees Plato as the hero, as represented by Prospero. I've suggested that it's very hard to see Prospero in that light. Depending on whether or not you believe that clock, we either have no time for questions, or we have 23 seconds for questions, or observations or reactions. Are there any questions, observations, reactions, comments?
Good job.
Terrific observation. I am obligated to repeat, for the sake of the videotape, that the comment here was "good job." Okay. Thank you.